Axiomatics webinar on centralizing the code, separating authorization logic from applications. We got two experts on tap for our session today. First of all, Jerry Gabel, who's the president of Axiomatics, and then David Broussard, who's the VP of Customer Relations. Two gentlemen who are well versed on the subject. And with that, I'll turn it over to our esteemed speakers.
All right, Kelly, thank you. This is Jerry Gabel. And David, it's good to be with you again on another webinar here from Axiomatics. I'm reporting today from the Gartner Identity and Access Management Show in Vegas, and so hopefully it'll be relatively quiet here. You never know when you're in Vegas. So the first part here, I'll start out with some introductory comments and some observations from our many conversations with customers on this topic of centralizing the code or centralizing authorization. It's known by many different terms in the industry, one of them being externalized authorization. I think that's really the theme for our presentation today. And what are some of the benefits associated with this? Well, what we see from customer experiences is that they get a lot more control within and across applications, a lot more consistency of this control, especially in lines of business where you have maybe several applications that perform different parts of a business process, and the ability to have consistent controls across them is a real benefit from an audit and control perspective. Also, for customers that do a lot of application development in-house, they can definitely speed up that process of getting those apps to market faster if they are able to deploy a central service for authorization and then allow their application developers to just call that service when needed rather than incorporating that code into their applications. And then I mentioned auditability. The fact that you have a central system with a standard-based policy language gives you a great capability to now audit the environment and be sure that you have the proper business or security or regulatory controls in place. And then finally, to be able to change them as needed. The business climate changes rather rapidly. Market conditions change, regulations and laws change. So the ability to make these updates to a centralized system independent of your application itself is also a great benefit for organizations. So David, I'll rely on you to advance me. Yeah, great. To the next slide here. And so here's an example of what we might refer to as internal authorization, or this is often the legacy approach where across your applications, whether you've developed them or even if you've purchased them from a software vendor, they're just littered with hundreds or thousands of these if-then-else clauses within the code. And this is where you might provision users into certain roles or groups or manage other attributes about them, and then hand off to the application to take care of access control in the code itself. So this is where you have things like, well, if the user is assigned to the project X, then fine, we'll allow a certain level of access. Or if the user is a doctor and they're in this department, you'll allow something. So this is the extent of access control in a lot of applications that are already deployed out there within
Jerry,
your environments.
If I may jump in, I've heard figures of up to 20% of a code base is dedicated to doing access control or some form of authorization. So just imagine if you could actually externalize that and save on that 20%.
Right. I think another example I've heard is something on the order of 10,000 lines of code dedicated to access control and security within a customer's applications. All right, so next slide then, David. Some of the observations I want to share with you, and this is not meant to be derogatory in any way, but just looking out at customers as we talk to them about externalizing their authorization capability, we find, generally speaking, 4 different phases of what we call awareness, and you see them here and on the following slides. I'll go through each of them. So the first one is more of a denial phase, where the organization is at such a state that it doesn't really need this kind of externalized authorization. David, if you could advance the slide. Thank you. They might be quite happy with using roles, access lists, group lists, and the like, and they're just not at a maturity level where they need attribute-based access control or externalized authorization. ABAC, of course, is another term that we use for this kind of technology, and they might not even know what ABAC is, and that's fine. It's just suitable for that organization. The next level on the next slide is where they start to recognize that the trend that there's definitely issues with, for example, their access review process, and there were some observations about that today and yesterday at the Gartner conference as well. A lot of people are in access review hell, as they characterized it. And these kinds of organizations may be planning for a move to a more of an attribute-based and externalized model. They may have issues with audit findings that have not been resolved over time with their current techniques and capabilities, but they're asking themselves, how do we get there from here? How do we move to an externalized and centralized model from the current state that they are in? Great. So what's the next stage of awareness here? It's more what I would characterize as an awakening. So they have established ABAC as the enterprise standard for new application development. They may already have in existence certain coding standards or procedures for their developers, so they might have an in-house API or some other kind of a middleware layer that makes it easier for them to transition to an ABAC model. Furthermore, they may have a project that's now been defined and funded. This is typically the time of year where these projects get finalized, for example, for a 2016 project. And many of these organizations have already built in-house some type of central authorization service, so they're quite familiar with the sort of requirements they have for functionality, for performance, and operational awareness, and so on. And David, I know you see a lot of organizations in this state, right, where they have a lot of good practices in place and they're just ready to take it to the next level. Is that right?
Correct. Yes, indeed. They've built perhaps their own homegrown central authorization service, like you stated on the last line here on your slide, but now they want to productize that or commercialize that offering and go to an off-the-shelf solution. Yes.
Excellent. I think that's a great segue to the next slide here. The final phase that I call enlightenment, where in fact they are, we see many examples of organizations making that transition from a homegrown service to a commercial product, to get more functionality, to get a vendor support, and so on. Or they have an early ABAC deployment that they're now expanding to more applications or to more types of resources, applying it to APIs. That's often a first step because it's a low impact implementation, but then expanding it to databases, and we're working with some early customers on even applying ABAC to big data resources. And furthermore, they really see this kind of capability as a key business enabler, and that's of course very important when you need to think about funding for a project to improve your identity and access management infrastructure and include an attribute-based access control capability. So David, on to the next slide here. I think at this stage you're going to take over and talk about this more from an application architecture and technical perspective. So I'll yield the floor to you for the moment.
Oh, it was about time, Jerry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
So yes, thanks, Jerry, for this great intro and walking us through the 4 phases of authorization awareness. I'll bring my developer's view on Jerry's view here. When I walk into a room and I start talking to the architects and the developers at different customer sites and I look at their current state of the art, what I see is a monolith. Sure, it's very peaceful, it's a great view, it's a great piece of stone art, but it's also very antiquated, not wanting to quip a joke, but it's the Stone Age of app development. When I say there's a monolith, what I mean is that the app has been built in one go and potentially been built 15, 20 years ago, and there's layers of sediment that have been added onto the app. It's monolithic, it's very brittle, there's no clear architecture, none of the functionality are decoupled. As a result of that, the apps tend to be heavy, they tend to be hard to be reworked to adapt to new requirements, if at all possible. And very often, by the way, the person who was responsible for developing that application or the team responsible for developing that application might be gone altogether. And that means that it's really hard to maintain the application. And by the way, if you think that it was just a one-off monolith here in a little corner of the company, no, you're wrong. There's a whole Stonehenge of monoliths. There's a whole field of monoliths lying around the enterprise. We're talking hundreds and hundreds of applications, and that's easy to understand if you think about it, because the need for IT has grown over the years. The need for IT apps, IT processes, data has grown. We're no longer dealing with just employees. Now we have employees and customers, customers and partners, partners and competitors and regulators. The amount of data as well has grown beyond what we could have imagined. Take healthcare as an example, where medical records used to be paper-based. Today we're dealing with EHRs, electronic health records. So there's a lot more of data, there's a lot more complexity, and there's a lot more processes and users to deal with. And what it leads to is siloed applications that are being developed side by side that are ignoring one another, that are repeating the same functionality, that therefore are really hard and costly to maintain. What it means for the companies, of course, is a much higher cost of maintaining those applications, a much higher cost of development, a longer time to markets as well. If you need to adapt to new markets to offer new functionality to your end customers, it's going to be harder to do that because now you'll have to adapt all your 10, 20, 100 applications. Also, what we notice is that the quality of the code isn't that great all the time, and that's partly because developers now have to not only deal with the security aspects of the app, but also the business aspect of the apps and other aspects. So that's not a great place to be at. So what if we could simply extract common functionality? That's not a big revolution. As a matter of fact, the idea of extracting common functionality is something that's been applied to other fields very successfully. Authentication, as an example, has been externalized from the apps over the last 10, 20 years. We no longer dream of implementing username password management within a given application. No. We rely on user directories. We rely on single sign-on functionality. We rely on third-party tools and products. Much like today, we wouldn't think of reinventing Federation or OAuth or other social login. We rely on that functionality being provided by APIs and SDKs and services provided by Google and the likes. But it's not just authentication that's been successfully externalized. Data storage has as well. We don't reinvent the database wheel. We just take one off the shelf and integrate it. We don't reinvent logging either. We integrate with logging frameworks. So with that in mind, and if we look at the current developer trends, such as an API-driven architecture, the notion that you want to focus on small reusable pieces or microservices as they're called, we will have this trend to promote reuse. And as you might all know, in the past couple of weeks in Paris, we've been having the COP21, which is this environment conference, so it's a good time to promote reuse, reduce, recycle. We really want to be able to decouple functionality so that we can reuse that functionality and be leaner, be more efficient. And that brings me to an analogy, the Lego analogy. As it turns out, when I was a kid, I was not a Lego fan, I was a Playmobil fan, but unfortunately, Lego is the analogy in today's webinar. With Lego bricks are very simple pieces of plastic. They can be small, they can be big. You can see the different sizes here on the slide. The point is that they're simple, yet you can build very complex, very advanced, very compelling functionality with those Lego bricks. You can build a Formula One car, you can build a castle, you can build an entire city. Okay? So think about that. When you develop your applications, you want to start from small pieces of Lego, and then you want to assemble them together to deliver the functionality that you're interested in. And you want your developers to focus on those bricks they're experts at, the business bricks. And then you want to let them consume other bricks off the shelf or as a service more easily. So if we relate that analogy back to application development, this is what a typical application landscape could look like. A bunch of siloed applications, black boxes, they're actually green on screen today, and we don't really know what they do inside. They each have their own little authentication piece, their own authorization piece, their own logging piece, their own whatever piece. They're monolithic. Now imagine that you could break it up, tear them apart, decouple the functionality so that you only keep the bare bones business functionality in that dark green box. And then the authentication piece, the authorization piece, the logging piece have been moved out. And then you can merge all those pieces into common frameworks. Your authentication layer at the very top, the logging framework at the very bottom, and of course, in there in the middle, in pink, you have the externalized authorization piece. This is the goal. This is what we aim to deliver with externalized authorization. This is where we see added value from, like as Jerry mentioned, from an auditing piece, from a time to market piece, from a adaptability piece. So what does ABAC and externalized authorization promise to deliver? Well, number one, it's externalized, meaning that the authorization logic, the access control, is fully decoupled from and externalized from your business logic. You have your app on the one hand, and then outside of the app, somewhere in an external location, you have the authorization logic. Number two, if you've managed to externalize the authorization, the next logical step is to centralize the authorization. Centralize your access control policies in one location so that you can manage them, maintain them, edit them, and audit them in one central location. You're going to save on the management processes. Number three, in bullet point 2, I refer to the word policies. What we mean by that is that, well, now you have a chance to standardize your authorization, and while you're at it, to express them as policies. Why policies? Well, simply because they're easier to understand, simply because they relate more to the original business requirements. So not only are you standardizing, but you're also bridging the gap between the business requirements and the authorization, the technical artifacts used to implement the authorization policies. And by the way, there is a standard out there called XACML, or Extensible Access Control Markup Language, which is a standard defined by OASIS and backed by the likes of Axiomatics, Boeing, Bank of America, Veterans Affairs, and also described in length by NIST, the National Institute of Science and Technology. So it's a great standard, it's very mature, been out here for 10 plus years. Now, these first three bullets, externalized, centralized, and standardized, will make your access control more flexible. Flexible in the sense that you can apply it to web portals, you can apply it to APIs, to web services, to business processes, all the way down to databases. Jerry, you mentioned the big data use case. We see more and more of those big data use cases coming. And now with externalized authorization, we have the easy ability to apply the same consistent, coherent authorization across those multiple layers, including big data. Fifth point, you want to have authorization that is dynamic, not authorization that is stored and that is static. In existing authorization models, you associate users to roles, you associate users to permissions. That's a very static model where you're going to have to re-provision authorization every time it changes. In attribute-based access control, in externalized authorization, the access control becomes dynamic. You can use parameters such as time of the day, location of the user, risk score, device type. And that brings us very well to the last bullet here. The authorization, because of that dynamic nature, becomes context-based and risk-aware. So you have a much better, a much more reactive authorization framework at hand once you've centralized your logic.
And David, if I could jump in here and add some more comments. And some of these capabilities that you mentioned really aren't possible within the application itself. You know, for example, if you need to check the status of a device, mobile device, whether it's registered in the mobile device management system or not, is its patch level up to current state? These kind of things your application likely can't handle directly, but of course an authorization service is better equipped to do things like that.
Indeed. So how does it work? you might wonder, we're selling this secret sauce. It's amazing. It's beautiful. But how does it really technically work? Well, Jerry, it's very simple. You begin by defining your building blocks, your Lego bricks from an authorization perspective now. And those are called attributes, hence the acronym Attribute-Based Access Control. And the good news is that you can think of and use any attribute you would like. It could be the user department, the user clearance, their role, or it could be focusing on the resource. It could be the type of object we're dealing with, that object's department, its classification, its owner, its status, its amount, if you're dealing with amounts, and many more attributes. It could be the action, it could be the time of the day, many, many more attributes. There's really, in theory, no limit to what attributes you could use. Jerry, you mentioned being able to use device information. Device type here could be yet another attribute that you could use. Using those attributes, you're going to assemble them inside policies. The policies, again, they help you bridge the gap between the business requirements and the technical world. An example of a policy is managers can view documents in their own departments. So you can have as many policies as you like. You can have generic policies, for instance, deny access before 9 a.m. and after 5 p.m. You can have very specific policies that deal with one given application. You can also have policies that are negative, policies that deal with exceptions. You can really have a whole breadth of different authorization policies. And now, of course, you need to decide where to enforce your policies. Are you going to deploy a proxy? Are you going to do it in front of a database? Are you going to have an interceptor? We'll dive a little deeper into those types of interceptors in part 3. And before we do that, let's have a look at a few examples of policies that we have that stem from a banking use case that one of our customers in the banking vertical shared with us over the last few months. This is a large bank in Europe. So the first requirement was that only managers could access transaction data. So that's the first bottom line policy. But on top of that, users, any type of user, not just managers, can view transactions only in their region. Okay, in their region only, not any other region. So that's interesting because now we're introducing the notion of that if a user is based out of a given branch, say London, they can only view those transactions that belong to that branch, London. These two rules are positive rules. The third example here, no one can edit approved transaction, is a negative example. We're disqualifying people, we're kicking people out. So if the transaction is approved, no one can edit it. Makes sense. The fourth rule here is more of a dynamic data masking example where if you think about rows of data inside a database, perhaps your transactions data is stored inside an Oracle database and you want to filter that data. Well, that fourth example will help you mask the field amount, the amount field, I'm sorry, if the user does not own the transaction. So no matter who the user is, whether they're a manager or a user, the amount field will be masked if the user does not own that transaction. That's a great dynamic data masking example. And the last one here is also a dynamic data masking example where no matter who the user is, no matter their relationship to the data, we will mask the credit card number, partially mask, as a matter of fact, the credit card number, replacing it with the familiar X's we see in the last 4 digits, the typical masking rule. And that brings us to part 3, the technical side of things, the implementation, the enforcement side of externalizing and consolidating and centralizing your authorization logic. Some of the best practices that we recommend customers go for is that they identify where to best deploy the interception layer. And when I talk to my customers, Jerry, I tell them, well, look, what's your current state? Okay, current state is state number 1. You have the authorization logic within each application. I tell them, decouple that, get rid of it, move it up. So we move to that step number 2 here in the middle of the slide where they've managed to move out the authorization logic. And then I tell them, identify the right location where you're going to put that enforcement point, where you're going to put that interceptor and deploy it. And when you do, try to aim for what I call an umbrella policy enforcement point, meaning a policy enforcement point capable of protecting multiple apps in one go. It's going to protect as many apps as it can in the same consistent, coherent way. Why? Well, simply because it will be cheaper to maintain, it will be more efficient to maintain. Suddenly you'll have one point protecting 5, 10, 100 applications. Not only that, but you also want to identify the frameworks you're dealing with. What framework did you use to develop your application? And within that framework, what interfaces are available to you against which you can develop your policy enforcement points? And in the following slide, I have a couple examples of those interfaces. If you do manage to identify an interface against which you can implement a PEP, a policy enforcement point, you will be able to develop a configuration-driven enforcement point. And that's very important. As much as you can, you want to have a configuration-driven policy enforcement point, because then you can turn it off, turn it on, tweak it, customize it through configuration instead of through code. It makes it more maintainable, more manageable. Finally, you want to aim for a loosely coupled enforcement point. What I mean is that the enforcement point should be pretty oblivious, pretty ignorant of the policies that you have within the authorization service. It should send the minimal amount of information that it needs to send. For instance, it should send the user ID, the action ID, and the object ID, but little more. It should not need to know that it could send the citizenship of a user. That's irrelevant. The reason for that, of course, is that the more loosely coupled your policy enforcement point, the more reusable it is, the more future-proof, change-proof it becomes. So if you can change your policies more easily independently of the policy enforcement points. So with that in mind, let's have a look at a couple examples we have here. First of all, we have policy enforcement points that I would call technology agnostic. And perhaps the simplest integration and the most popular integration we do today at Axiomatics is with API gateways, protecting web services, protecting microservices, and protecting APIs, JSON services, REST services. And for instance, we integrate with Axway API gateway, with Apogee, with a CA layer 7 API gateway, and IBM Data Power. If you have your own open source gateway, we can also integrate with that very easily. The compelling point with a gateway is that it gives us access to the entire message, and therefore we can make decisions based on the entire payload of that message. We can also integrate more in the identity space with web access management tools such as CASSO, formerly SiteMinder, Ping Access, or other products in that category. In addition, we can help drive authorization within federation platforms such as Ping Federate. Now, that's a very interesting use case. We can help determine when to issue or validate a virtual identity, a token, a SAML assertion. Not only that, but we can also help drive which assertions we want to insert inside a SAML token, as an example, so that those assertions are carried over to the target application. So this is one way of carrying authorization information. And of course, going back to the database security or to the data security and to the big data scenario, we can also integrate with products like Oracle, Microsoft, Teradata, IBM DB2, and other data stores coming in the pipeline. The great aspect to data security is that your enforcement point is transparent. It sits between the application and the database. The application is not aware that it's there, and the database is not aware that the interceptor is there. It's totally transparent to both parties, and on the fly, it will modify the SQL statements such that only entitled data is returned. Dynamic filtering, dynamic masking. Now, if we look at more specific technologies, say that you're a Java shop, well, you could actually implement very easily a servlet filter. This is an example that I developed with my customers time and time again. It takes 10 minutes to get a servlet filter going. It's going to look at your HTTP payload, convert it into an authorization request, send it off to the authorization service. Of course, if you're dealing with APIs or web services, then you could integrate with the relevant frameworks, JAX-WS and JAX-RS being the most popular ones. And in that architecture, you have the notion of a message interceptor and message handler that can intercept the message and similarly send an authorization request to the authorization service, get a decision back, and enforce that decision. Now, if you look at .NET as an example, it's the same story. You have similar frameworks, similar technology. So for web content, we're dealing with HTTP modules. For APIs, we're dealing with WCF message handlers. WCF is a pretty cool framework in the sense that it has a lot of hooks you can use. And then if you look at the .NET servers themselves, you could also have an IS-API filter at a higher level. So really, there's a lot of possibilities, a lot of places where you can easily integrate, and integrate in a configuration-driven and a transparent way.
And David,
Yes.
furthermore here, if the developers prefer lighter weight formats and encoding methods, then you can use REST and JSON directly without the need for an SDK to integrate with your applications.
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, we are, I believe, the first and only vendor to implement JSON over REST for the XACML request response. And what it means is that you no longer even need an SDK from us to integrate, because all you need to do is write a bit of JavaScript and send a JSON request to the policy decision point. Takes you 5 lines, 10 lines of JavaScript code, sends it off, you get a response back, and to enforce that decision within the response, again, another couple lines of code. Extremely simple.
Couldn't be easier.
No.
Almost couldn't be.
As easy as sliced toast. And that, Jerry, brings us to the Q&A session.
Excellent. Well, thanks, David, for finishing up that section. We definitely encourage our attendees to submit questions in the GoToWebinar Q&A box. And we've got a few minutes here. We'll probably cut our webinar shorter than usual today, trying to do a sort of a quick hit on this particular topic. And like I said, definitely invite our attendees to submit some questions for us here. And thanks for advancing to the next slide. So in just 1 week from today, David, are you doing this boot camp on database filtering? You just mentioned this a few moments ago.
Yes, it's going to be a duo with our product manager, Swidrith.
Excellent. We look forward to that. And usually you get into some pretty technical details on these boot camps. Is that right?
Correct. Yes. So we'll look at the nitty-gritty details of how to use the data filtering and how to develop for the Axiomatics data access filter and what it means for your applications.
Very good. Well, one question we can address, it often comes up in conversation is how does an organization really get prepared to move toward more of a centralized and attribute-based approach? And certainly we've written some different kinds of documents over time, different kinds of best practices, and people can reach out to us for some of those documents. One that comes to mind, David, is the paper we have on getting started with attribute-based access control. Are there some others that come to mind that you've written?
Yeah, I have this lifecycle wheel that I call the authorization policy lifecycle that essentially walks users through the different steps they need to think about in order to go from requirements gathering all the way down to implementing a policy, all the way over to running your access reviews on those policies, and then that closes the wheel, if you will, of authorization policy lifecycle. So it's a great way to get started and grow your policies over time.
Good. Excellent suggestion. And I think as a follow-up here, we have another question, and that asks, so they have a current application that's tied to AD using groups, and how could they move to a more of an ABAC or externalized model? I think this calls out the need to reuse, existing groups, existing roles, and other data where possible. What can you suggest?
Yeah, that's true. That's actually one thing that's important to highlight. When you roll out ABAC, you shouldn't throw out RBAC by all means. No, you should reuse your roles. You should reuse your Active Directory. So one common strategy that we see is that if you already have roles within the organization, they will become yet another attribute in your policies. You plug in the authorization service straight to the LDAP or the Active Directory so that it can fetch the information. What's interesting, though, is now you get a chance to perhaps re-engineer your roles in simpler ways. The other day, I met a customer that had a role called role name _ department _ brand. So you see that the whole name actually combined together 3 different concepts. Well, now that you use ABAC, you can break down the role into the 3 different parts. So you're going to have role name, manager, you're going to have department, sales, and you're going to have brand, Axiomatics. That makes it easier to maintain. It makes it easier to write policies and grow them over time. And more importantly, it makes it easier to write specific policies. Policies are going to be specific to a given department or a given brand.
That's a good comment. I was thinking also with the use of roles or groups in this attendee's example here, when you allow the application to just call directly and see who's in an LDAP group, great, it can do its own authorization, but there's no way to, to audit or report on that policy. It's hard to know what those groups are being used for. So if you put them in an ABAC policy, then we can actually do reporting and analysis on that, and it gives you some more transparency.
That's actually a point I want to stress, Jerry, because very often one of the limitations of RBAC is that you don't really know what the roles are used for, and more importantly, or very often, the role name doesn't mean anything anymore. We'll see customers that have roles called role 1_234_XYZ. How do you know what that means? So your role engineering becomes extremely complicated with ABAC because it's a policy, and because you get this chance to go back to, let's call it the basic or the atomic attributes, then it's easier to make sense of what's happening and what the policies mean, and therefore, like you said, Jerry, it's easier to run your audit reports.
Right. So in this example, for the question here, if today the application is just making an LDAP call when it needs to do an authorization check, so instead of connecting to the directory over the LDAP protocol, they would use one of your policy enforcement points, I think for .NET in this example. And so the application would now call the authorization service. And if in the rule it says that you need to be in the group of managers to access a certain function, well then the authorization service would look into the LDAP. So you decouple your application from the LDAP directory, and now your application calls the authorization service instead.
Correct.
Sound right?
Yes. Yes. And also what happens is that when the application called out to the directory, that was more coarse-grained. So there was logic in there that would have done more fancy processing of that role. Now you can move that into the policy instead of having it into your code.
Exactly. And then you can enhance that, right? You can add the checks for more attributes, from the policy server side, and you don't need to change the application any farther.
Right. One more point, by the way, Jerry, that I've just thought of is that's going to make it reusable too. So if you have other applications that could benefit from the same authorization logic, then it's just a matter of plugging it into the authorization service.
Right, exactly. Okay, well, I think we'll make today's webinar a short one. We thank everyone for attending. David, thanks for joining me on yet another webinar here. Good luck next week on the last boot camp of the year. Thanks, Kelly, for hosting us today. And we'll see you all at the next webinar or at a future event that Axiomatics is sponsoring. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Jerry. Enjoy Vegas.
Will do. Thanks, David.
Bye now.